Hi there, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Prestige Liquids. My name is Andrew, and as always, it is fantastic to have you here with me again on another whiskey review. Before I get started with the review, if I seem to be a little bit distracted, it's because of this little cutie. So she may decide to start running around all over the place. So yeah, if that happens, I apologize. She is only about 3 months old at the moment. So yeah, obviously very playful. But we're not here to talk kittens. We're here to talk whiskey. And today I have a very exciting whiskey to share with you today. And this is the Batch 7 Rye Whiskey from the Backwoods Distilling Co. So the Backwoods Distilling Co. Is an Australian distillery, obviously. They're located in the Highlands of Victoria. And one of the main things that really drew me to this particular release, as far as I am aware, this is the first whiskey put out by Backwoods that has been aged in white oak. All of the other releases that I have tried from them so far have generally featured French oak. They have also experimented with some Australian varieties of wood as well. But again, yeah, this is the first time trying something with white oak. As mentioned, this is their rye whiskey, bottled at 54% ABV. So I believe that this is their cask strength version. And as mentioned, this is the Batch 7 release. Again, I'm not 100% on this as well, but I believe that this is at least over 3 years. So a little bit older than most, say, Australian whiskey releases. They generally tend to be about the 2 year mark. But yeah, as far as I'm aware, this one is possibly just over 3 years. It's been handcrafted in the Victorian High Country from heritage rye grain, malted barley, and wheat. All right, let's pour a little bit into the glass and get started on the review. All right, let's see what we get. Cheers. Okay, so the first thing that kind of jumps out to me on this one in comparison to, say, some of the other whiskies that I've tried from Backwoods in the past is that it's not as spicy on the nose. I generally find that French oak kind of gives off a lot of spice and a lot of white pepper, which is normally something that you don't usually get in a white oak cask, which is what they've used in this. The rye is very dominant. You obviously have those like minty, earthy aromas, more baking spices. So I'm getting things like cardamom, cinnamon. It's also getting a very nice, like dusty cereal grain element. I'm assuming that's coming through from the wheat. One thing that I've been noticing in quite a few other Australian whiskies that I've been trying lately is that I'm starting to notice more of an influence of, I guess, like Australian bushland. I mean, typically from scotches or other whiskies and other scotches that you may have tried in the past, you may tend to notice a certain foresty vegetal note. But it could be suggestive. But with a lot of the Australian whiskies that I've been trying, I am starting to notice more of an Australian bushland kind of flavor profile coming through. So I start to get notes of things like eucalyptus, banksia, wattle, those types of like earthy Australian bushland kind of notes, which is exciting because obviously that's something that you're not going to get, say, from a Scotch or a bourbon or things like that. This is something that is obviously uniquely Australian. Very herbal, as I mentioned. You do have that minty rye spice coming in. Though one thing that I have started to pick out in some rye whiskies now is like a cola element. Yeah, I'm getting a kind of like a cola burnt caramel kind of sweetness coming through. Lots of vanilla and a touch of black pepper. That's also quite fruity. I'm starting to get things like apples coming through. So you got that orchard fruit influence. So apples, like freshly squeezed orange. Yeah, so there's a lot going on here on the nose, and it obviously is a whiskey that just keeps opening up and evolving the more time that you give it. So But unfortunately, I don't have an infinite amount of time. Time to move on to the palate and see how we go. So cheers. It's beautiful. So obviously, being that this is bottled at 54%, on that initial sip, definitely expect a bit of punch. You are going to get a little bit of that burn, but again, high ABV whiskey, it's to be expected. But as that strength starts to fade away, you're just left with this beautiful, thick, juicy mouthfeel. Um, Everything just gets coated nicely, and that is definitely a distinctive feature across the other backwoods whiskies that I've tried in the past. I believe I have tried about 3 or 4 other releases of them so far, and again, that is a consistent profile. Also, with in terms of their rye whiskey releases, they do generally do like a single malt and a rye release. Again, I think this is the second rye whiskey that I've tried from them, and even though different casks have been used, I can recognize that backwoods DNA, that backwoods style. So it's very interesting to see how, even though using different cast type materials, you can still see, or you're still able to experience essentially what is a backwoods rye. So that the cola note that I mentioned on the nose, for me on the palate, is definitely a prominent feature that fades through and then allows the caramel notes to come through, and then the vanilla, it starts to evolve into this creamy butteriness as well, which also adds to the mouthfeel as you're drinking the whiskey. I generally find in other whiskeys that I've had before that that initial mouthfeel experience that you get kind of only like lingers for a little bit on the first or second sip. But this one kind of builds as you drink it. So you get that syrupy feeling at first when you take that first sip, but then as you're making your way through the whiskey, it changes to this buttery, creamy texture, which is very interesting, and it's definitely a very fascinating part of the experience. Very nice oak notes. So I already mentioned the vanilla and the caramel, but now those more intense black pepper spices are starting to come through. The cardamom and nutmeg, cinnamon that I had mentioned on the nose also follow through. So it does have a very heavy baking spice influence. What is again the mintiness from the rye. One thing as well that I'm finding quite interesting about this is that the fruit elements were more prominent on the nose, but those aren't necessarily following through as much on the palate. The palate is definitely more of a like I mentioned, the baking spice element, but it also has a more earthy cereal grain style of flavor profile as well. I'm starting to also pick up notes of like dark chocolate, like cigar leaf tobacco as well. So it definitely has that dry vegetal element. And again, more of that Australian bushland influence. So think along the lines of eucalyptus and say all those kind of like Banksia cones, all those kind of things. If you've ever walked through, say, an Australian bushland, then you would be familiar with with some of these kind of notes. Another interesting aspect of this is that in general, say the other backwards releases that I've had have the casks used were generally ex wine casks, and they've done quite a bit of a series of that where they've run through say like Shiraz, Cab Sav, etc. As far as I'm aware, this one hasn't had any wine cask influence. If I'm wrong, please leave a comment down below. Moving along to the finish, it's generally quite soft. It's very pleasant and very aromatic. As it kind of like does its thing, I'm starting to get a bit of like a barrel char smokiness to it as well. So that's not something that I picked up on the nose or the palate. It is something that's coming up afterwards. So again, something different to add to the profile. Now, but it's also starting to take more of a floral tone as well. So it's more grassy. you've got that Australian bushland. I think that's the reoccurring theme of this release. It is just that beautiful balance of Australian bushland just influencing, say, the overall flavor profile. And look, like I mentioned at the start of the video, that could be something that is just kind of subjective to this, being that it's an Australian whiskey. I could just be hyping up those notes, but that is what I feel that I am getting from this. So yeah, that's what I'm going with. I have definitely been enjoying being able to detect that pure Australian influence in our local whiskies. It is definitely something that sets them aside from, say, scotches and other styles. Those orchard fruits are starting to come through, more of an apple influence coming in. I'm also starting to notice more like vanilla and butter, and there's also a bit of like a subtle like anise, or kind of like a licoricey vibe that comes in just at the very end. It's very subtle, but it's there. And again, just something different to kind of add to the overall experience of the whiskey. I have to give a big shout out. The team at Backwoods at the moment are just doing some like absolutely fantastic things. And I shouldn't just say at the moment, they have been putting out exceptional whiskies from the very get-go. I've been very fortunate to be able to try the batch one releases and a few of them in between, and they are just constantly putting out exceptional whiskies, and they're definitely a distillery that makes you excited to be able to try more and more of their releases as they come out. So I think I'll leave it at that. If you've been enjoying this content so far, please make sure you go ahead and hit the bell notification and the subscription button. My name is Andrew, and I'll see you all again on the next video. KIPPIS. Well, now, since you made it this far into the video, why not go ahead and check out some of these other whiskies that I have reviewed. I'll see you all again next time. Bye bye.